Is it spring?
Good morning, and welcome back. Fiona and the panel is just asking what's in my cup, but it's only coffee. It's not wine yet, so it's too early for the wine. So we've had some very lovely conversations. Can I remind the audience, we are averaging way over 300 people online. So I'm getting far more questions than what there can possibly be time. So please get your questions in early, and let's get what you want to hear put to the panel as well. We have co-designed this conversation with Fiona. She's a long-standing friend and has played an active role in where we ended up in the Joburg Indaba. She's the senior advisor, mining team, global advisory, Rothschilds & Co. in London, but she doesn't need introduction. And we couldn't think of anybody better positioned to address the topic of the changing geopolitics, the new Cold War for strategic minerals to fuel the energy transition. Is there such a new Cold War? Is this just hype? Fiona, over to you and your panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard, and good morning, everybody. That topic is a very big mouthful that we're talking about today, but we know Menell Swanepoel likes to keep things blunt at this Indaba. So to cut to the chase, we're going to discover whether the West can really walk the green walk as well as currently talking the green talk, given the Chinese current dominance of the critical metals space. So to address such a wide-ranging issue, we do need to draw on a broad area of experience, and this is what we have in spades today on our panel. Their bios are included in the pack, so I will simply introduce them alphabetically so as not to show any undue favoritism, because I think they all have very good insights. Stuart Brown, who a lot of you'll know has significant experience in mining experience in different parts of Africa, but also most recently, as a good contrast, is in Canada. Brian Menell, also long mining experience, but his importance today is that he was ahead of the pack in establishing a private company to invest in what I'm calling the new metals. And Richard Williams, who may not be as familiar to the South African audience, started out in the military and then city and mining experience he's had, not least as a stint as Chief Operating Officer of Barrick, and now operating a smaller operation in the US. So welcome to our panel. To launch straight in, could we start with Brian, who has already got in place at TechMet some assets in the new metal space. Brian, just for those not following these new areas as closely as possibly we are, could you say why you set up your company targeting a range of lesser known metals and minerals, the so-called battery and critical metals?
Sure. No, thank you, Fiona. When I first conceived of and set about creating what is now TechMet 4 years ago, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the global energy transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources and internal combustion engine driven vehicles to electric vehicles was gaining momentum and was inescapable and unstoppable. What was less well understood or recognized at that time and remains inadequately recognized is the fact that the key metals and metal chemicals going into lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles, renewable energy systems are in many instances in structural short supply globally, and the supply pipeline of these metals and metal chemicals is dominated by China, who has seen this coming and over the last 15 years has executed an enormously successful program to secure control over both primary resource in many instances and processing capacity for these metals and metal chemicals on a global scale. So our metals, which we target, where we see the most severe supply-demand dislocation that we're at the beginning of, are lithium, cobalt, rare earth metals, tin, tungsten, vanadium, and nickel. All of these are controlled, or the supply pipeline is controlled between 60% and 95% by Chinese interests. So there's massive value creation opportunities in this dislocation and massive geopolitical implications, given, the fact China's won a war that nobody knew they were fighting till they lost it. And while the United States and allies had their eyes closed, China's been allowed to acquire very powerful tools in one of the key drivers of the technologies that will define the global technological, industrial, and commercial landscape over the next 5, 10, 20, and 50 years.
Thank you so much, Brian. So moving on with the Chinese dragon, can we ask Richard, with his experience in all of those regions? Richard, we've called this discussion the Cold War, the emergence of the Cold War around metals and minerals. Do you see, what are your views on how the polarization over metals and minerals that the West needs might even move into something like a hot war with the tensions in Taiwan? And do you think the West will come out of, how the West will come out of this against China?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I think with respect to the competition for metals, which Brian's outlined quite clearly, I'd say it's unlikely for that purpose alone that we'll see this competition escalate into anything like a hot war. But what we will see is that competition could potentially increase the cost to the consumer in the non-Chinese states of the energy transition. Metals will be more expensive, or there will need to be significant investment in that supply chain, not just in sourcing the metals, mining, but also in refining, smelting, and transporting it and adjusting it away from the smelting and refining facilities that exist and are dominated in China. But with respect to giving the broadest answer to your question, Fiona,
and we'll come back to processing separately. Yeah,
exactly. Let's just speculate a little bit on what could happen in terms of a security situation whereby we have a flashpoint such as the Taiwan Straits, where we know that China seeks to ensure the absolute incorporation within the one China policy of Taiwan against some opposition. And we could envisage three scenarios whereby that plays out. You can envisage many more, but just for the sake of this discussion, scenario one is the continued situation we're in at the moment, where there is a degree of stalemate and tension with no party wishing to compromise the economic independence that exists between China and the rest of the world. And in those cases, demand for both electric or green metals and, really importantly, defense metals will continue to go up. And there will be an adjustment of supply chains over time. The advantages of that would be there would be no inevitable effect on the global economy, in that alternative sources of supply and alternative supply chains can be established over time. That's probably the most, I wouldn't say the most likely, but it would certainly be the most preferred by all parties. However, when discussing with friends in Washington this week and trying to get a feel for what Pacific Command, the American military command that looks into the Asia Pacific, and others in Washington are talking about with Viz Taiwan, is there is a real fear that this could emerge into a limited conflict over Taiwan within the next 5 years. And I think there are two scenarios there. One, China secures Taiwan militarily. I mean, it may or at least attempts to, but it doesn't draw in other parties, US, Australia, or elsewhere. And the second, which is much more serious, is that any preemptive Chinese action does draw in those allies, and it moves from being a very limited Korean type effort into something that is far broader. And in both of those latter two cases, one's going to find that the discussion that we're in at the moment, which is how do we ensure the world goes green, policymakers are going to put that down the priority, and whether they're going to bring security higher up the priority. And it's going to be very hard for us sitting here right now to anticipate quite how that would work out. But it is a major and significant change to the geopolitical environment that we're discussing at the moment.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Richard. So it's quite clear in either the war sense, or the hot war sense, or the Cold War over metals and minerals, that the West has to step up quite significantly in order to put its foot on the metals that Brian has outlined. As Brian has said, the processing is dominated by China, and a lot of the resources are found outside of the West, in particular Africa. So may I go to Stuart? Stuart, the West has to reset its relationship with these countries. It's lost ground to the Chinese. You are passionate about Africa and have enormous experience. How best can the West work with these African countries to benefit both the push for a greener world and for a better life in Africa?
Thanks, Fiona. I think if I go back and I look at the geopolitical space that's been described, I always say the West I see, and then I see China. So let's call it the West and the East, and then I see Africa dangling in the middle. And it's currently operating on the usual business model of producing most of the world's raw materials and exporting them in that format, predominantly these days to China, where let's use a broad figure of about 70% of all of those rare minerals and strategic minerals are processed. And it looks like it's continuing down that path. And then I come and look and say, what does Africa need to do? And I'm talking broadly in Africa rather than South Africa, but obviously we can get back to South Africa specifically later. And I look at what a country has. A country has basically two assets. It has its people and it has its mineral wealth. Yes, it might have good climate and various other things and look pretty, but it's got to make the best of its future with those two classes of assets. And generally the people are always there. They're very willing and passionate about leading the country or driving the country forward together with the government. So then you turn to what mineral wealth does a country have? And many countries in Southern Africa have all of these strategic minerals in abundance. But all they're doing is extracting them, often by, I think, partnerships that are completely misaligned to the benefit of the countries that are where they're being mined. And they're directly exported to the incredible benefit of China, which has now allowed it to be, through China's policy, and you can't blame them for doing it, the dominant force in processing many of the minerals that are becoming ever more strategic, as Brian was outlining right up front. So I think Southern Africa in particular is it's at an inflection point right now that it has to make massive change. It cannot just simply go along the lines of, well, we're going to mine these minerals, we're going to create a royalty stream out of it, we're going to empower it, and hope that that somehow filters down to the population, because that model hasn't worked and it hasn't beneficiated the country. I always think you only have one chance to sell your minerals. Every time you dig them out the ground, you sell them and they're gone. You don't get to resell them because you've exported them. And there has to be a complete strategic policy decision and strategic change. The countries that are rich in these minerals need to almost wake up and say, what is the new model? And it has to be alignment with companies, when we come back to the greener side of things, that are going to be or have been around for a long time, and dealing with, I think, strategic multinationals that have the capacity, the people, the systems, the processes, and the desire to drive the world to this new position, have to be engaged. So I think that's when Africa should be approaching the West to say, we're going to partner with you, but completely differently. We don't want to be exporting cobalt or like manganese or nickel and all of the minerals that are critical to where the new world is heading in their raw format. We need to create jobs, we need to partner, and we need to do it in a meaningful way. So that's how I see the opportunity for Africa or Southern Africa to react to this. Because if we just carry on as we are right now, the dominance of China will then dictate how the world achieves things. And I don't think they will stop at Taiwan. I just think that their whole policy is very, very clear to the world. It's going to dominate. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And Stuart, we've seen China winning hearts and minds, so to speak, not only buying the resource, but also donating infrastructure, all of those good things in order to indicate that they're helping the country in a broader sense. And that
but yeah, in infrastructure, they've certainly come through to, I don't think that's sustainable. And I don't really think that those, when you say winning the hearts and minds, if you actually look at the raw examples in Southern Africa that I see, I don't see that as being a sustainable business model. And I don't think the true beneficiation comes through. And I always feel it's like when the mine finishes and the resources are depleted, I'm not so sure how sustainable that is. Where do the jobs come from then? Where's the technology? And where's the true investment been in that?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that I agree that there's, they're winning the hearts and minds. I'm not sure that it's been fully accepted that that's their model. I think it's the model is being used, so it's the only one there and it looks attractive. But I think there's a better model.
Yeah, and there has been some backlash against the Chinese dominance. So presumably that provides bigger opportunities. Yeah. Just to go back to Richard. So let's assume that the US or the West decide it's a bit too hard at the moment to try and get back into Africa and some of these more difficult jurisdictions. And they decide, let's really go for mining and processing really on the North American continent, which some people are saying there is a push for. What is your perception, because you've been involved in permitting, in trying to get mines going, how long it takes, whether it's easy, whether you see it as feasible, really getting these industries onto a whole new level up and running in the US?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Again,
and Canada, yeah.
Yeah, I'll focus on the US, but the thing applies equally in Canada and in some cases even more so. If we just remind ourselves what happened in terms of the legal environments in North America, the United States of America is a good place to start. The critical period for environmental legislation was between 1969 and 1980-81. Where you had the National Environmental Protection Act in 1969 starting off, and then a series of other acts, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and then finally the Circular or Superfund Act at the end, that essentially changed completely the permitting environment and the operating environment in a positive environmental sense in the United States of America. And it's no coincidence that in 1981, the mine that I'm seeking to restart, which had a smelting operation, the largest lead smelter in the world at that time, was shut because of environmental pollution. It's also no coincidence that the amount of investment into mining in the USA switched from being in the United States into being in Africa and South America and elsewhere to meet their metal demands at that time. And the second thing that happened was they, in a relative sense, shut down their ability to refine and smelt metal in North America. And that applies to Canada as well. And so the question you pose, Fiona, is a very interesting one. Does one think that there will be a relaxation of those environmental regulations to shorten permitting timelines? My view is it's highly unlikely. Will there be a relaxation of those environmental permitting conditions and so on to allow an increase in investment in traditional refining and smelting capability in North America? I think it's also highly unlikely. However, technology, as we've been discussing earlier before, does play a big part here, because the refining and smelting capabilities of the 1970s are not those which are used today or would be built today. So new technology does play a role, and indeed the demand for metals, and different metals require different refining and smelting techniques, will provide some opportunities in North America. So I'd say that if you were sitting in the United States saying, where am I going to get my critical minerals from? There will be some US supply, but it'll continue to be constrained because of permitting and other conditions. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to find that supply from elsewhere, and that is primary metals as well as the ability to refine and smelt. So connecting to the point that Stuart just made a minute ago, and connecting it to South Africa, or Africa in the general sense, is there is real strategic advantage for the US as a customer, seeing investment in refining and smelting capability in Africa, where it's environmentally sustainable and it's sustainable for the host nations, as a way of ensuring they get the final product that they need for the electric vehicle revolution and the green revolution that they seek to deliver through this infrastructure and other bills, but not have to compromise some very strict environmental regulation that's in place.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is look at Rio Tinto's stalled copper project in Arizona, or HUD-based stalled copper project in Arizona too, to see that some very big names who are investing an awful lot of time and doing very, very good things are still coming across some very serious barriers that were established in law in the 1970s, 50 years ago or so.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's going to be very difficult to see on a macro scale, in other words, a scale that will seriously tip the balance of metals such as copper and so on, there being a change to that in North America, unless we end up in an emergency situation, which is where that geopolitical point I said before, where you're moving from being a competition for the rush to make your economy green to being a security competition, and you'd see different laws applying then, such as the 1942 Emergency War Power Act that basically shut down mines or transferred the source of production into critical metals.
Yeah. Richard, thank you so much. Brian, I'd like to bring you in there. You sit slightly differently because you already have operations in the US, and I think you're looking to find more. What is your perception on what Richard has just said?
I think Richard's quite right. As some of the answer to the scaling of the supply pipeline for these critical materials and balancing China's dominant position is domestic in the US and its neighbors. But it's a smallish part because of the constraints from an environmental licensing point of view, which might become more efficient, but they're not going to become easy or low cost, and they shouldn't. So the answer, part of the answer in North America, which we haven't touched on, which is a very relevant area of growth, is recycling. And we've, as TechMet, been the financier of what's now the biggest lithium-ion battery recycling company in North America. We built 2 plants. We're building another 2 plants, and we listed in New York a few weeks ago. And that could, in our view, in 10 years' time, provide about 25% of the battery metals going back into new lithium-ion battery manufacturing in North America. So it's part of the answer, but it's not the answer. The answer is global, and the answer is for US interests or non-Chinese aligned interests to be more effective at building capacity to produce and process in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And to do that with more US government, Japanese government, and European governments support, because that's what's necessary in order to counter China's position with respect to access to cheap financing, which is a key competitive differentiator. And that's a big challenge politically. China has tools available to them to mobilize private sector and public sector capacity, financing expertise much more effectively than is the case in the US. But they realize that it's lovely having Tesla and Panasonic, which have been at the forefront of the industries and growing every month. But the Chinese can close them down in about 5.5 weeks because they have to go to China for 75% of their inputs. So there's growing recognition in Washington and in Tokyo and elsewhere that this is a major geopolitical, national security and national industrial competitiveness issue that's growing in urgency every day. The issue is what you do about it. So it is I think, can I just take a step back to China. China, it's very important we counter China's dominant position, but it's also very important to appreciate China's role in the supply pipeline and technologies leading to a successful energy transition. If we want a sustainable, clean energy future for our kids and grandkids, we need to do it with China. I mean, China's got a hell of a head start and a very, very important role to play. So I wouldn't want to, we're totally US aligned as TechMet. The US government through the DFC is one of our biggest shareholders. We've got a vanadium specialty chemicals business in Arkansas. We've got the recycling business. We're busy with another recycling technology in Texas. We're busy with direct lithium extraction in California. So we're very US, totally China-free and US aligned. However, I wouldn't want to promote an anti-China positioning in the context of this massive global challenge. Our first challenge, that is, should be our first priority, is for the world to produce 5 times, 10 times, 20 times the present global annual supply of these key critical metals, so that in 10 years' time, we can have 200 million electric cars in the world instead of 8 million electric cars in the world. And that's an epic challenge. And to do that with high ESG standards and low carbon footprint requires a complete reinvention of our industry globally, Africa included, South Africa included. And that's our first challenge. To do it without being beholden to China is our second challenge. But I think that should be the order of priority.
Yeah, well spoken. And I don't think any of this is anti-China. It's just, I think, putting in context, given that China already dominates a lot of these. So, yeah. You've touched on a point that I was going to ask you about, and that's the financing situation. And absolutely what we've seen from China all along, not only in these particular critical mineral investments, but in competing with other Western mining companies, is that they appear to have zero cost of capital, the Chinese backed entities. And in the West, of course, not the case, and quite demanding shareholders, but also in this space, very, very, very difficult to value investments because pretty obviously costs, prices, demand, supply, all of these are so unpredictable in the critical metals at this point, particularly something like rare earths, where actually it's even hard to pronounce their names. So how do you value it? So do we need, or would you like to see, a huge global fund set up, maybe IMF type, not as big as that, but a fund where you've got participants from the West and Japan saying we need to have some funds available to invest strategically like China does, where IRR over the next 3 years is not necessarily the dominant measure?
I think that can be part of the solution. It's not an easy part of the solution because we need $100 or $200 billion of capital to go into our metals over the next 5 years to be able to supply the world adequately in 10 years' time. So it's a big undertaking. The answer is therefore multifaceted and might include some public sector pools of capital led by the US, Europe, Japan, which are there and are starting to be mobilized or starting to look at this space. But we also need the massive wave of available capital, which is ESG, climate change, impact investing mandated, to realize that mining is not a dirty word. Mining can be environmentally responsible and low carbon footprint if it's done right by the right people. And it is an essential component of a sustainable, clean energy world. So, we need that funding to be mobilized. How that happens, it's part of what needs to happen, is better PR by the industry and better delivery by the Western industry in terms of standards. And part of it needs to be governments encouraging, incentivizing, and in some cases mandating a flow of funds from those private sector sources into our industry. And that's not happening anyway as big and fast as it needs to happen. These projects have long lead times and the demand is growing exponentially. We're going to radically retard the electric vehicle industry in 3, 4, 5 years' time, in the same way that, chips are presently retarding their investment and production programs because there won't be availability of adequate lithium chemicals and cobalt chemicals and nickel chemicals and rare earths. And that's going to be to the massive detriment not only of the competitiveness of the GMs and VWs and Teslas of this world, but, you know, of the industrial competitiveness of non-Chinese economies and of a successful, you know, climate change mitigation technologies globally.
Brian, I'm conscious that I'm sticking with you at the moment, but just to finish this particular point, I know that you have in the past, I think, been critical that the big guys, the big miners, have not been moving into the space fast enough. And I saw with interest yesterday or the day before BHP going back into the DRC. So I suppose one of the points that we set out in the program was how can companies position themselves better for this transformation that the industry is seeing, and would one way be to become less risk averse?
There's no question the big mining companies are failing us because they are conservative and risk averse, and with a few exceptions, they're busy missing out on what will be the biggest mining boom of our generation, or in fact of the last 200 or 300 years. The reason being not only risk averse in terms of the geography of some of these resources that need to be developed, but the fact that a lot of these metals, the supply is dominated by small and medium scale projects that don't move the needle for the BHPs, the Anglos, the Rio Tintos of this world. You know, you can't deploy $1 billion in rare earth metals or in tin or in tungsten or in vanadium. You can to an extent in lithium, increasingly, you can to an extent in nickel, but a lot of these metals are you know, not adequately in terms of scale of project or market to justify the time, attention, focus, and management exposure of big global companies. And that's going to have to change because they have the expertise, they have the global reach, they have the capacity, they can finance, and they have to engage in our space. Unfortunately, they're not to a large extent, with a few exceptions. And in my view, they're probably not going to the extent they could and should. And therefore, the answer, sadly, is 500 TechMets, not Rio Tinto and BHP reinventing themselves to find the courage to go into the Congo, which they may, but it's going to be slow and marginal.
Yeah, thank you. And on that, to pull in the other two panelists, the other development that they're going to have to start working on, in my view, is the working with partners much more, like the oil industry has, but even a bigger step. So downstream technology people, all sorts of distribution partners, etc. So being more cooperative. And both Richard and Stuart have worked for big mining companies. And is your perception they're good at this? Let's start with Stuart.
I would say no. I mean, they put it on.
But I was hoping you were going to say.
Yeah, put it on the banner that we like partnering and we do that. But as long as you partner with them and you do it their way, then it goes smoothly. But and I think the point Brian's making, it's got to change. And I said right up front, if we're going to do the same thing, what are you going to get? The same answer. So we need to understand that it is capable. I mean, they have the capability. And I think the recognition of change from a government side, I mean, the government in power in each country is they're responsible to manage the resources for the next generation and make sure that it leaves it in better hands than when it first got it. And in order to do that, you do need to partner with the people that have the capacity. And certainly the big companies do, but we've got to change the speed of operation. And then I do think Brian has a point. The smaller, more agile companies are able to be part of that. So I would say you don't want to, it's like the diamond industry. You think you can operate in all spheres of it because you're a big diamond miner. And in fact, you can't because you're not good at some of the parts of it. So let the people that are good at that partner with them. Let them do the polishing. You know, no mining company is good at polishing because that's not their core skill. Stick to what you're good at. And what you are good at is managing the process and looking at a long-term future and looking at a different business model. So I think it will be a combination. But I think if you're just going to go knock on the door of a big manager and say, we'd like you to run the partnering project on this, I think it just might take a long time to get that car started and driving very smoothly along the road.
And Richard, having been parachuted into Barrick to change its thinking in some ways, do you have a view on partnering and how one skills old-fashioned companies and big global groups on this?
There's three. I mean, Brian touched on it very well. There's three things on partnership that are relevant to here. One is a large company providing money. Secondly, is a large company providing technical expertise. And the third is a large company providing some sort of relationship stroke reputation that can be valuable in the countries that you as a junior partner are seeking to work with. In the first instance, provision of finance, it's normally exceedingly expensive and very risk averse. So it's difficult to secure. Technical expertise, you can actually buy in the market outside the large companies pretty efficiently. And in the third case, a lot of the large companies come with reputational issues elsewhere in the world that deny them access to ESG finance. Because what really makes a difference here, whether you're big or small, is whether you can secure the license to operate. And from there, really important, you can secure capital at a reasonable rate to allow you to move quickly. And I think Brian put his finger on a really important point here when you spoke to access to capital, because there is the public capital, which one would like to see governments lean more into, DFC and so on and so forth is an important part of that. But we'd also like to see, and I'm going to double down on Brian's point, this very large pool of money, so-called ESG money, moving into mining in ways that really allow the small to medium size players to move very quickly on these opportunities. And I say this because I'll also double down on what Brian said. The company that I'm running at the moment is seeking to regenerate old mine sites that were lost as a result of those legislations are in place, to recover both the metals out of the ground, but to also recover the society and the economies that were devastated when the mine shut down. Huge advantages to that, and produce metals that will be useful for the world, not just in green transitions, but elsewhere. And the point that Brian mentioned about that and recycling and gaining access to money could be something of an advance or a leader in this particular space. But what one does find when one's engaging with private and public capital who is ESG sensitive, their first instinct is, can I put it somewhere else other than mining?
Yeah.
Can I put it downstream? And that's the partnership piece that one really needs to be working on.
Yes, sure. Sorry, and I've just noticed that we're running out of time. That I think the funds say, can we put it anywhere else other than mining? And sadly, can we put it anywhere else other than South Africa? So finishing off on our panel, can each of you say, how can South Africa position itself best for this transition that we're talking about? Stuart.
I think it needs to be led, if those big companies that want to operate there, that are, globally engaging in this and are truly meaningfully wanting to, transform themselves. I think it's got to be government-led with the approach of, having SADC. What are their aims and objectives? I think it's got to be led at a government level to realize the strategic assets need to be leveraged. And now is the time to be able to do that, to engage with the smaller companies that are, coming with new reputations and new skills and abilities. I think Richard makes very good points. The skills are always obtainable. You go out in the market, it's full of bright people that are able to come and deliver. But I think the South African government in particular has got to recognize what its strengths are. And it has an infrastructure and it has the core capabilities. And it's got to change its model and be led by the mining initiative and the government level from an energy perspective to recognize where the world's going and then look at all the assets around it in its own country and with its neighbors, and then work out how does Africa position itself to benefit from this enormously. It would be irresponsible if it didn't do that. That's my opinion on that.
Great, thank you. Brian?
I agree entirely with Stuart. I mean, South Africa has some very interesting resources in this space, in rare earths, which we're involved in, Palabora project through Rainbow, in lithium, or in other metals that are very relevant to the energy transition. To develop them successfully, you need to subsidize or at least find mechanisms to reduce cost of capital. And that is a product of de-risking the environment, and that's to some extent in the hands of government. And that can be done much more effectively than it's been done to date by government prioritizing these areas in terms of support and assistance and reaching out to the United States, to Japan on a bilateral government-to-government basis to encourage the deployment of cheap money in projects that are strategically relevant to the United States and Japan and Europe, and resources that sit in South Africa. And that can be done. It's not being done, but it needs to be done.
Thank you. Bernard, can we just give Richard 1 minute to give his, the most important thing is how South Africa can benefit. Richard?
Well, look, I'll just, the other two guys have covered it very well, but I'd say one thing is South Africa also has the opportunity to be a alternative refining and smelting hub. If there is going to be a transfer of the supply chain, which currently goes Africa, China, consumer, South Africa is well positioned to build that type of capability, should the economics make it work. And that goes back to Brian's point, if you can lower the cost of capital, then it probably would.
Thank you. And I would say green hydrogen with using solar panels in the Karoo. Right. Thank you, guys.
Do you need to disclose ownership of a large tract of land in the Karoo? What is your angle here? And I'm so glad you said green hydrogen, not blue hydrogen, after our hydrogen.
No, people who are talking to us are saying Africa's the new place for green hydrogen with its desert areas.
Yeah, I would suggest listen into Andre de Ruyter's session, I think tomorrow, when he's obviously talking about the journey that Eskom is taking and the role that green hydrogen and other energy sources could play. So that should be very useful. I've got quite a few questions, and Fiona, I must tell you, you and your panel have gone exactly where I thought we would go. Because obviously there's a West and a non-West conversation, or a China and a West conversation. But there's also a conversation about mining. And I mean, clearly China is not really big in mining, although they own some of the resources, but they are really big in the metal making side of the business. And I think that's a strategy which with hindsight is probably smart. If you think how they manage environmentally, you claim their cost of capital is zero. I don't think it's a concept they spend a lot of time on. And then obviously environmental and other permitting issues must give them an advantage. So I have really enjoyed the questions from Zola Khaka. The capital investment on infrastructure development has largely been to the benefit of Chinese companies and labor. Where is the goodwill that is alluded to? Now, I mean, obviously we touched on that. Is there anybody who agrees or disagrees violently with that comment and question and want to take it further? So where is there goodwill, or was this purely to the advantage of China Inc.?
I think if I could comment on that, I don't think it's, out and out China bashing is very constructive. I think China has made a big contribution and a real contribution to Africa. A lot of these Chinese funded infrastructure projects have been done cheaper and quicker than anybody else in the world could have done them. And they have created capacity and infrastructure in Africa that would not exist without Chinese engagement. Sure, that's been done by Chinese contractors. A lot of the money has gone back to China, and a lot of the labor has been Chinese. And that's a big issue with respect to a lot of that labor having been left behind. But nonetheless, the roads exist, the stadiums exist, the bridges exist, and they are a net contributor to Africa. So their intentions might not be honorable, but the outcome is net positive.
I want to follow up because you guys left me slightly confused. At some stages, it sounded like you think multinationals is the way to go. So let's be recolonized by the multinationals. Or should we be colonized by China? So perhaps the other two panelists in no specific order. Richard, first, do you want to expand? And we touch on it. But is this the space, especially when we get to the refining and the metal making, is this really a space where either China or multinationals, Western multinationals, are the true solution going forward?
There has to be an African solution to be sustainable. If you're looking at the advantages to those who've invested in mining in Africa over time, it's been disproportionately the internationals versus the host nations. And I think if I'll just keep on the specifics, if you were going to build refining and smelting capability in South Africa and establish that as part of an industrial policy, or that be a key tenet of an industrial policy, you'd want it to be owned by South Africa primarily, and be an African solution. I think that's an exceedingly important part of what needs to happen on a go-forward basis, and it's also a real opportunity for Africa to do that.
Stuart, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think we can't go back to the traditional model, and Rich is right. You know, if you look at, let's say, the last 30 years of mining, who's benefited? Many European shareholders that hold the multinationals. They've got a great dividend flow, and you know, look at what South Africa is dealing with now: mass unemployment, still exporting its minerals, trying to develop mines at a slower pace than it needs to. So let's reset that. I do think it's a combination of the big companies do have the capital, they have the support, they have the access to the markets, and they need to work, and government needs to, you know, not force them, but encourage them to work together to access those cheaper capital pools. Governments in themselves are able to raise capital at relatively cheap rates. And if they combine all of those capabilities, you can combine the new model that involves multinationals, or let's say the international companies, along with the smart niche players that have got the new technologies and developed it and have got the people access. So I don't think you can pick one, say we don't want to go back to multinationals only and let's live under the Anglo, BHP, Rio, and whoever else comes along, Glencore, but a combination of all of that infrastructure and capability they have. We'd be crazy not to utilize it, but to incorporate a more broader ownership of that. But it's not just ownership, it's about setting the model. And I'm passionate about changing the mindset of thinking you can't just issue the license, hope the company develops it, discovers it, brings it to fruition in 10 years' time. It has to be a combination of new government support and thinking. And there is access to funds available all over the world to pursue these. And if you're going to do things properly and environmentally, you need to have the companies that have those processes, that have those departments, that can put all of that in place from the word go, because then you know that your end game is already secured.
I'm wondering whether, thank you. Please carry on.
Yeah, just the thing to add to that is if multinationals go back in, it's the shareholders that also have to change their view, because they have a very rigid view, banging the drum on a certain aspect of ESG, but do they understand the changes that these companies would have to make in order to change their model, and would they be behind it? And I think the shareholders and the investment community actually need a shake-up and to understand things more.
But we do have with us Brian and Richard, at least, who are currently attracting shareholders to a story which is different. And we just listened to Mark Kutafani explaining eloquently how to better specify his shareholders. He had to sell his coal assets in South Africa. So shareholders are obviously, you know, sometimes a driver of what happens, and sometimes, significant sort of influence. I was wondering if Bruce Williamson has sent a couple of questions. And he's clearly a capitalist, you know, one of those capitalistic picks. He says, Stuart, to achieve true investment in Africa will require Western capitalist/entrepreneurial type policies. Are African governments keen to move away from more social-like policies? So, I mean, you make the point that you feel passionate about a different model and you see a role for government. But do we really expect an African country to become more capitalist than the West in order to facilitate this? Or is this where we approach the whole thing in the wrong way, perhaps, Stuart?
I think, you can't just stick on capitalist versus socialist. I think both parties have to move. And the point you just made about Mark said he had to sell his coal assets to pacify shareholders. I'm not quite sure how that helps anyone, because the coal mines are still operating. It's under different ownership. So I think the governments recognize there's capital there. How do you have to access that capital? And I do think shareholders, as Fiona says, have to take have to reset their goals in terms of, if you understand where the world is going, and Brian's saying we want 200 million, or there's capacity for demand for 200 million electric vehicles, yet we've only got the ability to generate 8 million. How are we going to get there? And if we're going to stay with the same model, and I'm saying I'm a capitalist and I'm not changing and I'm not coming in without a 15% return on my capital as a minimum, and the government needs to change and give me all of these discounts so that I will do that, we're just going to be sitting in the same place. And I think governments recognize they are the custodians of those minerals. And if they want change, they can actually make it happen quite easy. You want to come and mine here, that's how it works. You're not mining to export your minerals. You can mine them to send them to the smelter that we don't yet have. Well, there's the problem. How do we access the smelter? How do we access those component manufacturing? How do we skill up? And then we will let you export the finished component that fits in with that new supply chain world. Because just exporting the minerals to hope that we can participate in driving an electric vehicle one day, that we can afford it, is just not going to work. So I'm not particularly fussed whether it's a capitalist, socialist, communist solution. It just needs a new solution.
So because Paula refuses to pay me for this excellent job I do year after year as chairing this conference, I'm now going to abuse this panel to give me free advice. So, and the story is so telling. So I'm one of the owners of a private company that makes manganese metal. The only one outside China. 97% produced in China, 3% produced by us. 46 years ago, the government of South Africa funded this establishment in an obscure place called Nelspruit. The IDC funded it. It then went through various multinational hands. Samancor, BHP Billiton, who we acquired it from, and later then obviously the South 32. Now, this business is ideally poised to be a success story, but it needs capital. Brian doesn't even yet know that manganese metal is different to manganese mining. Sorry, Brian, I know you know differently. Must I go to the government? You must be crazy. You can't go to the IDC because they would be more interested in BE and other things. Eskom is clearly going to kill us. So we talk beautiful conceptually until the tacky hits the tar, and then we can't keep a 46-year-old success story alive, or can we? So where do I go? Brian, Stuart, Richard, I mean, let's get real. Brian, you first, and we've got very limited time for this free advice session.
I think an interesting trend which we're seeing is the end users, a lot of these specialty metals and metal chemicals, realizing that to secure preferential access to supply, they're going to have to take equity type risk in the pipeline of supply. So be it General Motors, Tesla, LG, or anybody using these battery metals, which includes specialty manganese metal chemicals, they are now open for business. They don't know quite how to do it. They don't understand the pipeline nearly well enough to engage in it, but they're doing a lot of work on it, and they will be very interesting sources of capital and support going forward. And we're doing that, as TechMet, obviously, we're working with GM and others, with respect to financing engagement in the pipeline in order to secure ESG compliant, reliable, predictable, price smooth supply, which they all need for their EV programs.
And of course, you can't be dependent on Eskom electricity and supply a green metal going forward. Stuart, your sort of insights on these technical challenges as they play out?
I think if I look at our product, we've been traditionally thinking, how do we get closer to the manufacturer? That's we mine diamonds and we sell them to, let's say, the customer base. But of late, we've been looking at how the consumer's changing their purchasing habits, their purchasing knowledge, and we're now going more to the sort of the consumer end of the scale, cutting out all of those people. They'll still be involved, but we're now talking to the retailer and saying, you want access to our product and you want access to the finished product, but you're going to have to talk to us right now, and we're willing to engage with you. So I think you've got to work out who are the net customers of your final finished product, and that's who you go and talk to. Whether you need power from Eskom, or you can then say, well, we need to put solar in because that's all linked to it. You've got to go to all of those people. That's the new model. You're going to involve all of them and have a different equity ownership of your 46-year-old asset to get there. But I agree, it's a challenge. Go to the government as they're currently positioned. You'll get nowhere. You'll have to give up half your business, and it still won't be developed. So we're far more talking to the retail end, the customer now. That's who we're talking to.
Richard, final comments from your side.
Thanks, Bernard. Again, with respect to access to capital, which we all have the same problems with, what the challenge with you're sitting in a country which has got a fantastic mining tradition, and you're producing green metal. The one thing that we all know causes real problems when access to capital, beyond both the good things, you're technically competent, you're in the right place, etc., is fiscal stability. And it's this area that governments can really help. So if South Africa is able to provide for businesses such as you fiscal or regulatory stability, preferential perhaps for those green metals, you'll start seeing capital flow. And so that's where government responsibility comes in. I know it's a dialogue in terms of like all partnerships are, but boy, wouldn't it be great if you could put something on paper that would really genuinely look like the South African government is partnering with you over the long term and your accesses to capital.
Fantastic. Fiona, now you understand when you came up with the idea for this panel, I said, yes, please. I mean, it was self-serving, as it always is. Fiona, thank you to you and your panel. It is such an interesting topic. I mean, we heard from, Mark Kutefani that he took Anglo from mining to metals and minerals to mineral solutions or metal solutions. Early on, Richard spoke about there's a competition underway for metals, and where do we source the mining from? Where do we do the refining? And the big pictures and the world is at some silent war for these strategic metals of the future, the green metals, the battery metals, the energy metals. What an amazing topic. I think we've all deserved a cup of tea. Panel, thank you very much. That was exactly what we hoped to achieve. Final comment from you, Fiona?
This is only the beginning of the debate. So many
Indeed.
nuances. So thank you for giving us the opportunity. And yeah, three very good guys is what I think. Well done to them.
Thank you very much. Huh?